On the night of November 24, 2009, a young medical student named John Edward Jones entered Nutty Putty Cave in Utah with his brother and a small group of friends. It was supposed to be an adventurous outing during the Thanksgiving holiday, a brief return to childhood thrills in the caves they once explored as boys. The cave itself lay hidden in the Utah desert, about 55 miles southwest of Salt Lake City, its entrance little more than a dark hole in the earth. Inside, the passages quickly shrank from open tunnels to narrow tubes coated with slippery clay. But John, 26 years old, was no stranger to challenges. He had grown up climbing, swimming, and caving with his family. He believed this would be just another test of endurance, a chance to relive old memories. Yet only a few hours later, he would find himself trapped headfirst in a hole barely wider than his shoulders, his chest crushed by the unforgiving rock. What began as a harmless family adventure was about to turn into one of the most haunting cave tragedies in American history. Nutty Putty Cave was not a place for the faint of heart. Unlike the grand limestone caverns that attract tourists with colorful lights and wide chambers, this cave was a labyrinth of clay-filled tubes and constricting passageways. Its most infamous routes carried ominous nicknames: Birth Canal, Scout Eater, the Big Slide, and the Aorta Crawl. Each was a narrow squeeze that demanded visitors flatten their bodies, inch by inch, through cold, slick corridors that pressed against their ribs. In the days before the tragedy, the cave had been dry, with no recent floods or heavy rains to threaten explorers. At first glance, the conditions seemed safe, but the very structure of Nutty Putty Cave was deceptive. The clay coating its walls made the rock feel almost soft, luring cavers deeper, yet it also caused the tunnels to collapse unpredictably. The passages were rarely uniform, one section wide enough to crawl, the next tightening into a vice. For inexperienced adventurers, this cave had already proven dangerous. In fact, several people had previously required rescue after becoming stuck, though all had survived. On that night in November, John Jones and his companions carried only the basics: headlamps, a few ropes, and determination. There was no specialized gear for widening passages or monitoring oxygen. The group's confidence came partly from nostalgia. John and his brother had explored caves in their youth, and the thrill of returning as adults made them feel bold. The early stages of the descent only reinforced that feeling. The first chambers, though narrow, offered enough room to maneuver. Laughter echoed through the clay halls as their lights danced across the walls. Yet subtle warnings lingered in the air. The cave's stillness, the smell of damp earth, and the unyielding press of stone should have reminded them of the risks. The walls bore the silence of prior struggles, faint scratches from boots and helmets, marking places where others had wedged themselves too tightly. But in the excitement of exploration, those signs were easy to dismiss. For John, the adventure felt controlled: just another squeeze, just another tunnel. What he did not realize was that the passage he chose was not the birth canal he thought he knew. It was a dead-end fissure, narrower and more unforgiving than anything he had faced before. John Jones slid forward on his stomach, believing he was approaching a familiar passage known as the birth canal. This section of Nutty Putty Cave had gained a reputation for tight squeezes, but it also had an exit. Experienced cavers knew that, with patience, the canal could be conquered. John had no reason to believe this night would be different. But the fissure he entered was not the birth canal. It was a nameless crevice, a jagged slit in the earth that narrowed the farther he pushed in. At first, it seemed manageable. He extended his arms above his head, wriggling forward as the clay scraped his clothes. His chest compressed against stone. Breathing became shallow, yet he pressed on, confident that a chamber must lie just beyond. Then suddenly, his body stopped. The walls pressed against his ribs, his shoulders wedged immovably. When he exhaled, he could slide forward an inch. When he inhaled, the rock tightened like a trap. Realization struck he was upside down, with his head angled downward and his legs bent awkwardly above him. Gravity itself had become an enemy, forcing blood toward his brain and chest, while robbing his lungs of space to expand. John tried to reverse, but the angle made retreat impossible. His chest scraped raw against the stone as he pushed with his heels. The passage allowed no give. Every attempt only wedged him deeper until his body rested nearly 400 feet from the cave's entrance, in a fissure scarcely 18 inches wide and 10 inches high. Panic welled up. The cave, which only moments ago had echoed with laughter, now swallowed his voice. His brother Josh, hearing the struggle, crawled toward him. The beam of Josh's headlamp flickered across John's boots, trembling as his brother kicked helplessly. "I can't move," John gasped, his voice strained and shallow. Josh tried to pull him back, gripping his legs and tugging with all his strength. But the rock refused. Every pull sent a jolt of pain through John's chest. His breathing grew ragged, his words punctuated by desperate pauses. In the darkness, the reality became undeniable. This was not a simple jam. This was entrapment. The group scrambled to find help. Cell phones had no signal inside, so a runner was sent outside to contact authorities. While they waited, Josh stayed close, talking to his brother, trying to keep him calm. But John's position was brutal. Upside down, with his chest compressed, oxygen drained quickly. His face grew pale under the dim light. His words slowed, but he clung to consciousness, whispering prayers and asking for reassurance. Minutes stretched into hours. The cave that had once been a playground now felt like a tomb. Every sound a drip of water, the scrape of boots against stone, the echo of a distant shout magnified the sense of dread. The clay walls seemed alive, tightening with each attempt to move him. By the time rescuers arrived, John had already endured hours of torment. The narrow tunnel admitted only the thinnest volunteers, who had to crawl in headfirst themselves to reach him. They shone lights into his terrified eyes, touched his shoulder, and told him they would not leave him behind. But as they examined the crevice, the truth was grim. Pulling him free would be one of the most difficult cave rescues ever attempted. And so, the long ordeal began, an ordeal that would push the limits of human endurance, test the ingenuity of rescuers, and ultimately expose the brutal indifference of the underground world. The first rescuers reached Nutty Putty Cave within hours of John's entrapment. It was late on November 24, and the night air above ground was sharp and cold. Floodlights and emergency vehicles crowded the desert floor. Beneath them, deep inside the clay passages, John Jones remained pinned upside down, his breath shallow, his voice faint. Rescue teams quickly realized the magnitude of the challenge. The fissure where John was trapped was not designed for extraction. The tunnel was so tight that only the slimmest rescuers could reach him, crawling headfirst into the narrow passage. Each one had to maneuver past jagged stone, lying prone on their stomachs with their arms extended, before they could even touch his boots. Working upside down beside him was nearly impossible. The first strategy was simple: pull him out. Ropes were fastened around John's legs and waist. Volunteers braced themselves against the rock, straining to tug him backward. But every pull only caused the stone to dig deeper into his chest and shoulders. John cried out in pain. His breathing grew shallower. The team stopped immediately, fearing they would crush him. Next came a more complex plan. Engineers and rescuers constructed a pulley system. Anchors were drilled into the cave wall, and ropes were threaded through metal carabiners to create mechanical advantage. The idea was to ease John backward inch by inch, sparing him from sudden jerks. Hours passed as they worked by flashlight, the sound of drills echoing through the cave. Finally, they began to pull. For a moment, hope surged. John moved. His body shifted slightly upward. Rescuers outside the tunnel cheered quietly, believing the worst might be behind them. But then, disaster struck. One of the anchors tore free from the brittle cave wall. The pulley system snapped violently, and John slid back into the fissure with a sickening thud. The failure drained morale. John, who had endured more than 12 hours upside down, was now slipping in and out of consciousness. Gravity forced blood into his head, swelling his eyes, numbing his limbs. He spoke less and less, his voice trailing into whispers. Rescuers reached in to hold his hand, assuring him they were still there. He whispered prayers, at times asking for songs of comfort. More strategies were attempted. Teams tried drilling away rock near his torso, but the space was too cramped for equipment. Air compressors and power tools could not be maneuvered. They attempted to pass food and water to him, but swallowing upside down was nearly impossible. Every hour that passed made his condition worse. Above ground, his family waited anxiously. John's wife, pregnant with their second child, clutched their daughter and prayed. The entire community of rescuers, more than 100 strong, cycled in and out of the cave. Some returned exhausted, their arms scraped raw from the clay. Others entered determined, convinced they might succeed where others had failed. But time was the true enemy. After 20 hours, John's body began to shut down. His breathing slowed. His words ceased. Rescuers continued to work desperately, but each attempt met the same reality. The cave would not yield. As the 24th turned into the early hours of November 25, the situation grew dire. The once bright lights outside the cave now seemed dimmer, the chatter of teams replaced by grim silence. Everyone knew they were not just fighting the cave, they were fighting against the human body's limits. And those limits were almost reached. By the early morning of November 25, John Jones had been trapped for more than 24 hours. The cave's crushing grip was unrelenting. Every heartbeat in his inverted position pushed blood toward his head, swelling his brain and straining his heart. Rescuers knew that the clock was no longer measured in hours, but in minutes. Inside the narrow fissure, the air was heavy and still. John's skin had grown pale, his lips tinged with blue. At times, he murmured fragments of prayer, his voice barely audible. Volunteers who squeezed in to reach him tried to keep him awake, speaking softly, offering encouragement. They touched his hand when they could, telling him he would soon see his wife and daughter again. He listened, but his replies grew weaker. The rescue team made one final attempt. A new pulley system was anchored into the wall, designed to pull him free more gradually than before. Outside, every rescuer held their breath as the rope tightened. Inch by inch, John shifted upward. His boots scraped against stone. The tunnel groaned with pressure, but for the first time in hours, progress seemed possible. Then, in an instant, it ended. With a sharp crack, the anchor tore from the fragile rock. The pulley recoiled violently, striking rescuers and scattering dust through the passage. John slid back to where he had been, his body slamming against the jagged walls. A collective gasp echoed through the cave. Hope drained from the air. After that collapse, John's condition worsened rapidly. His breaths became shallow gasps. His pulse slowed. The rescuers remained beside him, but they could do little more than comfort him in his final moments. They sang hymns, whispered prayers, and held his hand as his strength ebbed away. Around midnight, John's heart faltered. His body trembled, then went still. The official cause would later be listed as cardiac arrest and asphyxiation, the inevitable result of being held upside down for nearly 27 hours. But to those who were there, it felt less like a medical condition and more like the cave itself had claimed him. Silence followed. Deep within Nutty Putty Cave, far from sunlight, more than 100 rescuers had given everything they could, and yet they had failed. His brother Josh wept quietly in the dark, unable to comprehend that the playful adventure they had begun together had ended in irreversible tragedy. Above ground, the news rippled through the rescue camp. Faces hardened, shoulders slumped. The reality was devastating. John Edward Jones would not be coming out of the cave alive. And worse still, they understood that retrieving his body would be almost impossible. The fissure was too tight, the danger too great. Even in death, the cave refused to let him go. As the first light of dawn touched the Utah desert, the weight of the loss settled in. A husband, a father, a son, and a brother had vanished into the earth. Nutty Putty Cave, once a playground of explorers, had become his grave. In the days that followed, grief rippled across Utah and beyond. News outlets around the world reported the story of a young father who had gone into the earth and never returned. His wife, Emily, pregnant with their second child, spoke of his kindness, his faith, and his love for adventure. The Jones family gathered to mourn, united by both heartbreak and pride in his courage. For the rescue teams, the outcome was unbearable. They had given everything, hours of labor, scraped bodies, sleepless nights, yet still walked away with the knowledge that they could not save him. Efforts to recover John's body were quickly deemed too dangerous. The fissure was simply too narrow, too unstable. And so, after solemn debate, officials made the decision to seal the passage forever. Today, Nutty Putty Cave remains closed, filled with concrete. It is both a tomb and a warning. Visitors no longer crawl through its clay-coated tubes. Instead, they stand outside a silent mound of earth that holds one man's story. The lesson is haunting but clear. In the underground world, confidence and preparation are never enough. Sometimes, the cave decides.